Welcome to The Explainer. So this week, the US farm economy felt like it was being pulled in two directions at once. You had this massive new trade deal that promised a huge boom, but then, back on the ground, the weather is raising some pretty serious concerns. The big question is, which of these forces is going to win out? Let's get into it.
The week really kicked off with this number just grabbing all the headlines, $8 billion. And it's the centerpiece of a brand new trade deal with one of America's key partners. So where does that $8 billion figure come from? Well, it's from a freshly finalized trade agreement between the US and Japan. And on paper, it looks like a huge commitment. Japan has agreed to purchase an additional $8 billion worth of US ag products. We're talking corn, soybeans, things like that, on top of what they already buy every year. Now, when you start to do some of the early math, you realize this is a massive lift. I mean, for Japan to actually hit this target, they might have to nearly double what they're currently buying from the US. That could push them into the top tier of buyers, almost on the same level as Mexico for corn imports. You know, that would be a really huge shift in global trade flows. But okay, to really get what that $8 billion means, you gotta have some context. And while it's a big number, for sure, it's still dwarfed by the Phase 1 trade deal that was signed with China a few years back. That agreement called for a staggering $40 billion in purchases a year. Now, that number was never actually met, but it was a major driver for the markets for years.
And this quote, it gets to the heart of why so many market analysts are skeptical. They argue that tracking these deals in dollars is just notoriously difficult. I mean, think about it. Grain prices fluctuate like crazy. The same amount of money can buy a completely different amount of corn from one month to the next, which makes it almost impossible to know if these commitments are really, truly being met. Still, the administration hailed it as a massive win. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins even suggested that a golden age for American farmers is around the corner. But you know, that kind of optimism is running headfirst into some very real, very immediate, down-to-earth problems.
So while the trade news offered, a dose of hope, there's this growing anxiety that's building around the weather and the very real impact it's having on this year's harvest.
Drought conditions have just been getting worse, and they're expanding across key growing areas, especially over in the eastern Corn Belt. We're talking Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And it's not just the dryness. Farmers are also reporting that southern rust disease is spreading fast, and now they're having to watch for the threat of late-season frosts up in the northern Midwest.
So this is what farmers are actually seeing in their fields. And now, pretty much everyone is just waiting to see if the USDA is going to reflect these issues in its next big crop report. That's the WASDE. Believe me, there's a ton of pressure on them to get these numbers right.
You've already got private firms putting out their own forecasts. The commodity brokerage StoneX, for example, just trimmed its yield estimates for both corn and soybeans, citing that dry August we had. But even with those cuts, these are still projected to be really big yields. So the real debate is whether the USDA will do the same, because last year, under very similar conditions, the agency was super slow to lower its numbers. And what that meant was a lot of farmers sold their grain at lower prices before the official figures finally caught up to reality.
But weather isn't the only wild card that's creating all this uncertainty. The other big one is demand. And in American agriculture, that conversation, it always leads back to China.
With trade negotiations kind of on a temporary truce, China has been really quiet, buying its immediate soybean needs from Brazil instead. And that absence, it has put some noticeable pressure on U.S. soybean prices, right as farmers are getting ready to head out for harvest.
Okay, but here's where there's a little bit of a mystery going on. The USDA has reported several very large soybean sales to unknown destinations. A lot of analysts believe this is a strategic play. The thinking is that maybe up to half of these sales could eventually be revealed as Chinese purchases, basically held on the books to be used as a bargaining chip when those high-stakes negotiations start back up.
And that right there, that's the consensus on the street. As Brazil's supplies start to run low later in the year, China will simply have to come back to the U.S. market to meet its huge demand. So for traders and farmers, the question isn't if, it's all about when.
Now, these big shifts in trade and weather, they aren't just hitting corn and soybeans, they're sending ripples across the entire ag economy. Let's take a quick look at two other markets that are really feeling the effects.
So first up, there was a major policy change that took effect this year in the biofuels world, and it is dramatically changing how things flow.
The Inflation Reduction Act created a new tax credit that only applies to biofuels made right here in the U.S. See, the old credit applied to imports too. As a direct result of that change, imports of biodiesel have absolutely plunged by 94%,
and renewable diesel is down 85%. This is a huge shift, and it's creating more built-in demand for American-grown feedstocks like soybean oil and corn.
And at the same time, the cattle market, which has just been on an absolute tear, saw a pretty significant downturn this week. A lot of analysts are suggesting that the market is just plain overbought and is probably due for a price correction, especially since that seasonal demand from summer grilling always starts to fade in September.
So after a week of all these conflicting signals, what's the big picture? Let's recap the key forces that are pulling this market in completely different directions.
You've got the optimism of a major trade deal clashing with the harsh reality of a drought on the ground. You have the entire market waiting anxiously for official government numbers, all while holding its breath for China to make its next move. It really was a week defined by this constant tug-of-war between hope and uncertainty.
All of this volatility, from trade fights to totally unpredictable weather, it really raises a much bigger question for all of us. In a world that's this interconnected, are these constant shocks and this level of uncertainty, is this just the new normal?